Cool. Hi, everyone. So my name is Billy, and I'm here to talk to you about making art with JavaScript. Before I start, a bit about myself. I work at a company called Open Door in San Francisco. We buy, renovate, and sell homes in about a dozen markets across the country. And in my free time, I help organize a monthly meetup called UtahJS in San Francisco. We meet on the first Wednesday of every month, and it's been running monthly since about 3 years ago. And this is my handle on Twitter, where I'll be tweeting out a link to my slides and demo afterwards. So it seems like there's a new JavaScript framework every single day, right? There's Angular, React, TypeScript, this and that. And this is great because it gives us a lot of tools to work with, but they all have their clear defined purpose. There's a right way to use them, there's a wrong way to use them. And all these utilitarian frameworks make me want something like when I first started programming, where things are more exploratory and open-ended with no clear utility in mind. I think JavaScript is an incredible flexible medium that's perfect for this, so it can be used towards this end and create art. When I think of creating art with JavaScript, two artists come to mind. They're Joseph and Annie Albers. They're artists from Germany who later moved to America. And they studied together at an influential design school in Berlin called Bauhaus. Joseph created works like this. They're bold, graphic, and iconic. He mostly worked in the media of paint, glass, and paper. And Annie created works like this in weavings, drawings, and jewelry. Now, it's worth noting here that at the Bauhaus, the design school, she and all other women were barred from pursuing painting as a study formally. So it's kind of ironic given that the Bauhaus movement had some radical ideas around art and design, but it couldn't recognize or move past its own deep-seated issues against women. I think they're great candidates because their works are mostly concerned with color, pattern, and composition. And these are things that we can easily reproduce in JavaScript. The first thing I like to reproduce is Joseph's most famous work called Homage to the Square. So Homage to the Square isn't actually just one painting or a thing. It's actually a body of work with hundreds of pieces produced over many, many years. So there are some notable visual patterns to these. So most obviously, they're a series of 3 or 4 squares nested within one another. And less obviously, they tend to come in 2 flavors. So you'll see some here that are mostly in the same color palette, so blues and greens and yellows and reds. And you'll see some that are more of a contrasting color palette, so greens and reds, blues and yellows, and so on. So let's take these 2 things about composition and color and break them down into our own further principles to create our own images out of them. So let's start with something easy, the size of the squares. So the first square that you see in the center here is around 40% the size of the canvas. And the following squares go up in increments by around 20% until they grow to the full size. The second largest square is around 5% from the bottom of the canvas, and the succeeding squares are moved up in increments of 5%. And before we go on any further, we should take a quick color theory break, which is my favorite kind of break. And so imagine taking all the hues in the world and displaying them out into a wheel like this. So if you want to learn more about this, by the way, you should watch Visnu's talk from JSConf Iceland called, I think it's called HSL, the RGB you've been waiting for. Now, if you were to take 3 samples from around the same area of the color wheel, you'd get what's called an analogous color set. So this is where the hues are basically the same. If you were to take 3 samples where they're roughly a third of the way apart, you'd get what's called a triadic color set. So with those definitions in mind, you can say that these works are more analogous, whereas these words are more triadic-ish. So some of them are more complementary than others. So complementary meaning 180 degrees away on the color wheel rather than just a third of the way. So let's move on to the code. To generate these palettes, we'll be using a color system called HSL. And this stands for hue, so what color it is, saturation, how intense the color is, and lightness, how light or dark the color is. To generate our analogous palette, we'll be first generating a random color. So this color should be on the lighter side, so with a lightness value between 60 and 90%. And then we'll create another color of a very similar hue and set the lightness value to be much lower. So these two colors essentially represent the two bookends of the spectrum that you'll be working with. Then we'll be calculating the steps in between these two colors. So in this example, the difference between the hues is 34, so the steps should be 34 divided by 3, which is around 11, like so. And now we have our analogous palette. Now to create a triadic palette, we'll start with 2 random analogous colors. And then we'll take the first color's hue and roughly get the triadic hue of that, and then generate 2 colors based on that. And this should give us the roughly triadic hue palette. So here's a demo of how that works. Now you see that the analogous colors are pretty similar, and the lightest or the darkest colors aren't always the biggest or smallest, so you get this fun varied effect. So this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more, as always. So Khan Academy has an article on homage to the square. So there's this really choice quote in there that says, "Stand back from this painting and look at the whole thing. Are the squares stacked up on top of each other like cut out pieces of construction paper? Are they sinking underneath each other as if you're looking at a painting of a tunnel? Each painting explores the same basic question. Can an artist create the appearance of 3 dimensions using only color relations?" So Joseph Albers explored this question in his medium of canvas and paint. So now the question for us is, how can we explore this further in our medium of JavaScript? One of the possible answers here is for the squares to react to the cursor, as if the squares are following the cursor around. So this means the squares can rotate towards the cursor, as well as translate it along the x-axis, as well as the y-axis. Keep in mind here that to deepen the sense of space, the effect should be more pronounced on smaller squares. So for example, if the smaller square were to rotate around 10 degrees, a bigger square should only rotate around 3 degrees. This makes the smaller squares seem closer to us in space and the bigger ones farther away. These are functions that we'll use to rotate and translate the squares. So the function rotates each square such that the smaller the square is, the more pronounced the effect is. So the more it rotates, and the more it translates as well. And same thing for the translation functions. So you can see here that the effect on the smaller square is a lot more pronounced in terms of rotation and translation. And because of that, they seem closer in space to us. And the bigger ones, they're a bit more subtle, so they seem farther in space to us. The second piece I'd like to talk about is called Fox2 by Annie Albers. Now, if you look at this pattern closely, you'll see that it's a random grid of right triangles, and they come in 1 of 4 orientations here. Now, with this knowledge, we can create a simple function that generates a random number between 1 and 4, and based on that number, we output some corresponding triangle, like so. Now, if we were to create 1 SVG polygon per triangle, then we'd end up with around 900 polygons. So this is a pretty naive implementation, and the DOM would get cumbersome and hard to work with. So it'll make the rendering a lot less performant as well. What we'll do instead is we'll take all those shapes and then stitch them into a single thing. So instead of having 900 individual polygons, we'll have a single path that represents all the triangles. SVG paths are a way for us to draw complex shapes in code. So it comes in with these 5 operators. M for move to, so move between 2 points without drawing anything. L for line, draw a line between 2 points. A for arc, draw a section of an oval between 2 points. C for curve, an arbitrary Bezier curve between 2 points. And Z for closed paths, as in you're done drawing the shape, so just fill it in. Here's an example of what that would look like. First, we instantiate a variable called triangle path. This is where we'll be storing our SVG path instructions. We use the M operator to move to these coordinates. Then we use the L operator to draw a line to the right. Then the L operator again to draw a line down and to the left. Then the Z operator to say that we're done to close the shapes. We repeat this for each of the triangles and append it to a single string. So this means that we have a single element that contains 900 shapes instead of 900 individual polygon elements. Now let's get into the palette of the piece. You can see here that it's fairly simple and analogous. But if you look at our larger body of work, you'll see some really vibrant pieces here too. So really bright red and blue right up against each other. Now with that knowledge, we'll create two palettes, analogous and complementary. And complementary here means that the hues are 180 degrees away from one another on the color wheel. Here's a demo of how that turns out. So you can see here that we generate a new random pattern every single time. And we can use a similar technique that we saw in Homage to the Square to generate our analogous and complementary palettes. Wait, there's more. So if you look at closely at the original work, you'll actually see that there are two sets of triangles. There's the darker triangles in the front, and there seems to be what seems like shadows right behind it. So this makes like the darker ones are closer in space to us, and the lighter ones are actually just shadows of the darker elements. If you remember our sample from earlier, a shadow would look something like this. We want to deepen this effect in our generative piece. So to do this, we have to keep in mind that the shadows move in the opposite direction of the light source. So in the cool sun with the sunglasses over here, it moves to the right. The shadow moves to the left. And the sun to the right. The shadow to the sun to the left, shadow to the right. Also know that the triangles are cleft at the edges. So it's as if you're peering through a pair of windows and the room is full of triangles for some reason. So with these two observations, we can make two statements. The window should translate towards our cursor, and the shadow should translate away from the cursor. And because the windows are closer in space to us, its translation effect should be much more pronounced. And the combination of these two things will create this interesting parallax effect. With this interaction, note how the windows translate to reveal other parts of the triangle pattern that you couldn't see before. And at the same time, you can see the shadows translate away from the cursor as if the light source is moving around with the cursor itself. The third final piece is called Orchestra, which is also by Albers, and this one is very goth. Now, when you look at this one, you can see that it has a grid of around 23 by 25. And for each point in the grid, there are 4 different configurations of lines. So they go from top left to bottom right to bottom left, top left to top right, so straight across, and blank. Similarly to the right triangle generator that we saw in the previous piece, we can create a simple function that picks a random number between 1 and 4 and generates the corresponding line, like so. Now let's talk about palette. So here you can see that it's a pretty simple high contrast palette, and we can define high contrast to mean large difference between the L values between the two colors. So here, the difference is pretty big. Whereas if you look at our other works that look fairly similar, you can see that there's some more low contrast analogous color sets. So we can define low contrast to mean low differences between the L values between all the colors. Now you can see that there are 3 configurations of lines here in the demo. And note that they're configured such as the diagonals don't cross, just like in the original piece. And they create this illusion of clusters of lines like the veins on a leaf, but in reality it's just a grid. And just one last one, swear. Okay. So we can apply our imagination here to create an illusion of depth. So what we'll do here is we'll try to group each of the orientations of lines on separate groups, and then try to rotate them at different rates to make them seem like they're different Z indexes from one another. So we'll put the horizontal lines on a single group, the top right to bottom left ones on a single group, and the top left to bottom right ones in a single group. And what we'll do here is that for each of these layers, we're going to apply rotation along the x and y axes. To illustrate this, we're going to use these three dogs, and we can assume that at this point that the things that are closer to us in space are going to rotate more dramatically. So things in the foreground should rotate more dramatically, whereas things in the background will rotate more subtly. And same thing for rotating along the other axes as well. So now we know the closer the layer, the bigger the effect. So this is what this idea would look like in code. The foreground should rotate the most, around 15 degrees, midground a bit less, 13.5, and background even less, 12.15. And then we'll be applying a simple linear scale for each of these layers, which gives us something like this. You can see here that the different kinds of lines are rotating at different rates in the demo. It almost looks like the lines are floating in space. Cool. So I hope this is a useful overview of the different ways we can use these practical technologies to make something strange and beautiful. JavaScript doesn't have to be used for utilitarian web applications. It can be more freeform and exploratory and used to create art. We can apply color theory with HSL. We can create generative compositions with SVG paths. And we can create the illusion of depth with transforms. If you enjoyed my talk, you should watch this one by Amy Chang from JSConf Iceland. It was a big inspiration for this talk. And finally, you can go to this link to see the demo and source. And you can tweet me your questions, and I'll also be tweeting out a link to the slides and demo afterwards. Great, thank you.